If you'd like to turn over to the passage that Brother Jim read for us a little while ago, Colossians chapter 4. We're going to be spending some time there tonight. Brother Norman, in his lesson this morning, talked a good deal about the words that we use, or the words that we don't use, and in sharing the gospel with others, and it was excellent. And so what I'm hoping tonight is as we talk a little bit more about our words, that our lesson will kind of dovetail into and complement what he said for us this morning. So over in Colossians, the 4th chapter, Paul here, just to give us a little bit of context, and Brother Jim read the context for us, but Paul here is discussing open doors to preach the gospel, as well as setting a proper example about two groups of people. Verse 5, he talks about those who are outside, that is, those who are not Christians. So he talks about setting a good example to those who are not Christians. And second of all, in verse 6, he talks about those who ask questions about our faith. So this is probably most likely speaking about non-Christians also, but about those who would be interested in why we live the life that we live. And so that's kind of the context. And so of particular interest tonight in our study is what Paul says about the speech of the Christian. How do we speak to those who are outside and to those who are outside and ask questions about our faith? And so there in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6, first of all, Paul says, let your speech always be with grace. Now, we know the stock definition of grace. But it's the definition that we use when we're talking about God's grace toward us, and that is His unmerited favor. But when it's used in the context of us bestowing grace on others, it just literally means something good, giving something good to others. And so that's what Paul is talking about here when he says, let your speech be with grace. It means let whatever you have to say to these people be for their good, or something that is beneficial for them, or something that is encouraging to them. But he also says, let your speech be seasoned with salt. Now, this is where we kind of run into a problem because, and the young people will really understand this, when you talk about somebody whose speech is salty, that's not a compliment. That is, it indicates when they talk about someone being salty or their speech being salty, it's those who use improper language or coarse or disrespectful language or vulgar language. But that's not what Paul's talking about here. You have to kind of go back to, what was Paul talking about the way salt was used in the first century? Well, what does salt do? First of all, it enhances the flavor or improves the flavor of whatever it's added to. That is, it's something that is beneficial. And also, salt in Paul's day was used as a preservative. So salt would guard against spoilage and rot. So Paul's really saying the same thing he said when he said, let your speech be with grace, let it be seasoned with salt. In other words, let it be beneficial. And let what you say be something that preserves a relationship rather than spoiling a relationship. So that is what Paul is saying here in reference to how we speak to those who are not Christians. Paul is saying, make sure that what you're saying is beneficial for the good of the one who hears you, and make sure that what you say is not rotten or spoiled, and that it does not portray the opposite of the life that you claim to live before God. Because as Brother Norman said this morning, words are very, very powerful. Our speech can betray us. Our speech can betray our hearts if we do not use speech that is full of grace and seasoned with salt. So why? Why do we need to speak this way? Verse 5, again, Paul says, walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. And again, Paul has previously asked them to pray for an open door, to preach to the lost. But then again, and I'm going to, sorry Norman, but I'm going to keep referring back to your lesson this morning. You remember what Brother Norman said? He didn't maybe say it in these words, but the preacher is not the only one responsible for spreading the gospel. It's my job too. It's your job too. And so we have to be wise in the way that we speak so that we don't waste any opportunities that we may have to lead them to Christ. You know, with a lot of people, we have very limited opportunities to share the gospel with them. So if we waste those opportunities or blow those opportunities by speaking inappropriately, who knows if we'll ever have that opportunity again? Or who knows if we have let slip by the only chance we will ever have to make a positive impact on that person? Do you remember the song that we used to sing, "You Never Mentioned Him to Me"? The picture there is standing on the judgment day, and you are seeing others being judged and they're being condemned, but they're people that you know and that you've come in contact with, and they look you in the eye and they say, "You were a Christian. You knew the gospel. You met me day by day, but you never showed me the way. You never mentioned him to me." We could be the only opportunity that that person ever has to hear the gospel. And if we waste it or if we blow it by the speech that we use, brethren, I don't want to answer for that on the judgment day. I don't know about you, but I don't want to have to answer for letting an opportunity slip by. And so that's why it is so important that we use what is listed up here on the screen, is that we use discernment, that we use discretion, and we use, that's a big word, circumspection in our communication with others. Sorry, I couldn't think of a shorter word than circumspection to get across the point to be made, but we'll explain it here in just a minute. So this is the way we do it, the way we speak with grace, and having our speech seasoned with salt is using, first of all, discernment. And as you can see there, this word, it is a Bible word. And it comes from this Greek word that means to separate thoroughly. So it means to be able to look at something and to be able to draw some conclusions about it. To be able to separate one type of information from another type and classify it and then act appropriately upon it. Probably one of the best examples is over in Matthew, the 16th chapter, where Jesus is speaking there, and he's essentially talking about discernment. Matthew chapter 16, beginning in verse 1, he says, "And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came, and testing him, asking him that he would show them a sign from heaven. And he answered and said to them, When it is evening, you will say, It will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times." They knew what discernment was. They could look at the sky and tell by the sky what the weather, they could discern what the weather was going to do. But he said, you cannot discern by what you've already seen and heard that I am the Christ. That's discernment. It's being able to separate pieces of information and act appropriately. Look over with me at Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5. And we're going to begin in verse 12. The Hebrew writer says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of youth have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil." And so through a constant study and application of God's Word, those who are spiritually mature should be able to tell good from evil, to discern. So how does that then translate into our speech? How can we be discerning in our speech? And again, I'm going back to what Norman said this morning. When you're talking to someone about the gospel, we need to discern, first of all, where that person is in their spiritual journey. Because if we're talking to them about the death of the Son of God on the cross for the sins of mankind, and they don't even believe in God, then our speech is pointless. Okay? So, there's this idea of being able to take, again, pieces of information and discern, and then to know what words to speak, where to begin, and how to speak. So, discernment. But another thing that needs to be present is this idea of discretion. Now, this is not a word that is specifically used in the New Testament or even in the Old Testament that I'm aware of. But the principle of discretion is there, and it's very closely tied to the idea of discernment. And Webster defines it this way: having or showing discernment or good judgment in conduct, and especially in speech, capable of preserving prudent silence. We'll come back to that in just a minute. So let's look at some examples where the word discretion is not used, but the idea is there. If you turn over to the book of Proverbs, the Proverbs writers had some things to say about this idea of discretion. In Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 2, the tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the mouth of the fool pours forth foolishness. The fool just says whatever comes into his head, and sometimes he lets whatever he says bypass his head and come right out his mouth. That is the idea here of what is being written in Proverbs. Also, if you go back one chapter to chapter 14, look at verse 3. In the mouth of a fool is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise will preserve them. And then down in verses 7 and 8, go from the presence of a foolish man when you do not perceive in him the lips of knowledge. The wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit. Bottom line, discernment just means discretion means being careful with what you say and how you say it, and also knowing when to stay silent. You know, there's another proverb, I'm going to be honest here. I don't know if it's actually a biblical proverb or not, but there's a proverb that says, better to be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. We need to use discretion in the way that we speak so that we do not, again, waste or blow opportunities. And finally, there's this idea of circumspection. And again, this is a Bible word. And it means to do something exactly or diligently or perfectly. And you can see in this word circumspection also the root of the word circumference. You know, the circumference of a circle is all the way around the circle. And so the idea here is to examine something all the way around before you speak, so that you'll know the proper way to go or the proper words to speak. Getting all the information or as much information as you can first before you speak. And so let's look at a couple of, again, biblical examples that speak of this idea of living or speaking circumspectly. Over in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 8, he sent them, this is Herod, sending the wise men to see Jesus. He said, he sent them to Bethlehem, and he said, go and search carefully for the young man or the child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. So that idea of searching carefully, that's this Greek word. Go look, go make a full investigation and find him. And so that's the idea again of being very diligent in how we do things. Go with me to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. Let's begin in verse 11. We have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them, for it's shameful even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light. Therefore, he says, awake you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And so, again, we need to be aware of where sin lives and what sin looks like, and we're to be on the lookout for it and avoid it. That's living circumspectly. And so then speaking circumspectly, again, is getting as much information as we can before we speak, not coming in the middle of a conversation and just inserting ourselves into that conversation without knowing what it's about. This is what it means to be circumspect in our speech. So, as we close tonight, I want to just very quickly hit on two areas where it's this discretion and discernment and circumspection are needed in our speech. And we're not just talking about the spoken word here, because I think I can say this without much fear of being proven wrong. We speak to each other electronically much more than we do vocally nowadays or face-to-face. We don't pick up the phone and call each other too much anymore. We don't speak face-to-face too much with people anymore. A lot of our communication is done digitally, over text, over email. And so, we're not just talking about the spoken word here. And I'm going to tell you that the written word sometimes is a lot more dangerous than the spoken word, because you don't have the context of facial expression and all of that when you're not speaking face to face. So where do we need this? First, there's this idea of profanity. And of course, when we hear the word profanity, the first thing that we think of, or first thing I think of, is curse words. Those bad words, those four-letter words that we were all taught, you don't say those. Okay? And that's true. That is profanity. But profanity is not just curse words, because making something profane means taking something that is special and making it common, using it in a common way. For example, the name of God. The name of God is holy because it stands for one who is almighty and who created us and who is holy. But yet, how many times a day do you hear and see people profaning the name of God? And the biggest place that we see it today is in 3 letters, O-M-G. That is everywhere. It is even on children's toys now. Taking the name of God and profaning the name of God, using it as if it's a common thing. We need to be discerning and discreet and circumspect in our use of our language and refraining from that which is profane. And there's a quote, there's a saying that I learned from one of the deacons in the congregation that I grew up. He only ever said it once in my hearing, but I have remembered it ever since he said it. And he said, profanity is the feeble attempt of a weak mind to forcefully express itself. That's what profanity is. We don't know how to say anything any better than using profanity to get our point across. But what does the New Testament say about it? Over in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, it says, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers." Does that sound familiar? Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6, "Let your speech be with grace, seasoned with salt." And again, Paul here says, don't let corrupt words, profanity being part of that, come out of your mouth, but speak the things that build people up and give them something that they can use for good. You go over one chapter to Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 4, he says, "Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving things." He's talking about how Christians should act. And he said, Christians don't have any business doing foolish talking or coarse jesting, which would include profanity. And over in Colossians chapter 3, our book that we're studying from tonight, Colossians chapter 3 and verse 8, and again he says, "But you yourselves are to put off all of these things, anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth." So, how do we use discernment in profanity? Do we know the difference? A lot of people don't know the difference between profanity and just everyday speech nowadays. I work with folks who are educated, that have the same, if not better, education than I have, but yet profanity is present in every sentence that they utter. That's someone who doesn't know how to discern what's profane and what is not. But we as Christians, we need to know the difference. Discretion. Is my use of profanity going to help or hurt the cause of Christ among those who are outside or among my brethren? Or do I need to find a better way to express myself? Circumspection. Have I considered all of the ramifications of the use of profanity on my soul and on the souls of others? Brethren, I will venture to say it's going to be very difficult to convert somebody with a filthy mouth. We cannot have a filthy mouth and hope to have a positive influence. So, and I say that I bring it not because I think that any of us, and I certainly hope not, have an issue with profanity. I hope and pray not. But it's all around us. And the temptation is great sometimes to use that language, especially when we're trying to really, get down to know somebody and kind of get on their level. But we have to not, because it is not going to end well. And finally, in our use of the gospel, and again, this touches, I think, on some of the things that Brother Norman was speaking of this morning. This really speaks more to how we say something than what we say. Too many or too often, I think, perhaps we have become more interested in winning the battle than saving the soul. To put it another way, I think too often we have begun to use the sword of the Spirit not as the precision instrument that it is, but as a bludgeon to beat people over the head with what we know and why we're right and why they are wrong. Unfortunately, I think that the past few generations, and I'm going to include my own in that, have been guilty of this, of using the gospel as a bludgeon, as using it as a means to only win the battle than to save the soul. And so, in so doing, many times we use the word, although it is truth, to destroy rather than save. Because the Bible used, the gospel used inappropriately can burn bridges. Not the Bible itself, but the way we use it can burn bridges. But what does the New Testament again say about our use of words when we are teaching the gospel? Go back with me, if you will, to Ephesians, the 4th chapter, Ephesians chapter 4. and verse 15. Paul says that we are to speak the truth in love. What that means is your motivation for speaking the truth is love, not to prove the other person wrong, to show where they are wrong, to condemn them. It's to save their soul. And so it needs to be used in love. So, and if that is our motivation behind discussing the gospel, guess what? The right words are going to follow. If our motivation is winning an argument, guess what? The words are going to follow to win the argument. And the context of, if you read the context, we don't have time to do that tonight, but the context says you have to receive the training to speak the truth in love. It's not something that necessarily comes naturally. And over in Acts, the 20th chapter, Acts chapter 20 and verse 27. Acts chapter 20 and verse 27. Paul here says, I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. And there is a need to proclaim the whole counsel of God, positive and negative, heaven and hell, love and judgment. But there's a proper way to proclaim it so that bridges are not burned. Now, it may be that the receiver opts to burn the bridge, but we need to be careful to never let it be, our speech be in such a way that we use our words, that our words become the match that set that bridge on fire. If they choose to burn the bridge, that's unfortunate, and they will answer to God for that. But let's not let our words be the reason that they burn that bridge. So, talking about discernment, do we know the difference between speaking the truth in love and speaking it just to win an argument? Indiscretion, is the way I present the truth going to help or hurt the cause of Christ among those who are outside and or among my brethren? And circumspection. Have I considered all of the ramifications of how I speak the truth on my soul and on the souls of others? I could have gone on some other areas tonight that we could have talked about, but I thought these two were especially important. And where does it all start? How can I rest assured that all of my communication is going to be done in the proper way? If you go over to Matthew, the 15th chapter, and verse 17. Matthew chapter 15 and verse 17. Beginning. Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. And so, Jesus it's a different context here, but the principle is there. That the words that we speak and the way that we speak them start right here. They start in the heart. The heart has to be properly trained in order for the proper words to follow. And so Paul, over in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, said, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. In other words, This is what will train our heart to speak properly, or to produce the right words to speak. Is when we dwell on these things, when we dwell on the things of God, when we dwell on the love of God, when we dwell on our love for one another, when we dwell on our love for our fellow man who is lost in sin, but who is created in the image of God and whose soul is precious in the sight of God. That'll motivate our words. That will allow us to speak the proper words. Has to start with a pure heart. But it also means, in order for this to happen, that we are going to have to pull our hearts and our heads out of the filth and the violence and the corruption of the world. And that's not easy to do. But we've got to pull our heads out of there and immerse them in the Word. And that's going to produce words that are full of grace and words that are seasoned with salt, so that we can bring other people to Christ. And so tonight, as we bring the lesson to a close, if there is anyone who is not a Christian, I don't see anyone who wasn't here this morning that's not a Christian, that didn't hear Brother Norman's sermon. So I'm not going to preach his sermon again. If you were here and you heard that, you know what you need to do. And we want to help you do it because we love you. God loves you. We want you to be saved. He wants you to be saved. If you're a brother or sister who needs our help, who needs some comforting words, some words that are full of grace and seasoned with salt, we'll do our best to do that for you too. If you have any need whatsoever this evening to respond to the gospel call of Jesus Christ, we're going to sing number 268. Please let us know how we can help as we stand and sing.